listening to Shoot It Now, your weekly podcast about indie filmmaking and big budget films with award-winning filmmaker Craig Newland.
And welcome to another Shoot It Now podcast. I'm joined by a writer-director with 3 different films behind him. His latest film stars Casey Affleck and Michelle Monaghan. Vaughn Stein, welcome to Shoot It Now.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
I was looking back at your filmography and saw that early in your career, you've done a lot of second and third assistant directing on some pretty big productions, including World War Z, Beauty and the Beast, The Danish Girl, The Fifth Estate, Pirates of the Caribbean, and others. I want to ask you first off, how much did being on a bigger production like that shape, influence, and inform you as a director leading into his first feature film?
It was invaluable. It was invaluable. I mean, it was hugely important to me, sort of working my way up as an assistant director and learning the ropes. You know, learning how film sets work, learning how crews interact, learning from the ground up. And I was very, very blessed. I got very lucky when I finished at university. I'd already done bits and bobs of work experience, and I started working as a runner. And the first thing I got offered was what I thought was a romantic comedy, because I was sent a call sheet for something called Rory's First Kiss, which turned out to be the working title for the Dark Knight. So my first days on set after finishing at university were locking off in central London while we were doing all the Gotham City Police Department stuff. So I was completely hooked from then on. And yeah, I think for me, learning how to do it from the ground up, being able to watch incredible directors and DPs and actors work, watch the way they interact, and to be part of that process, it was an honor and it was invaluable to me, and it's really stood me in good stead, sort of, moving into what was always my dream to write and direct.
And did you go to film school?
No, I went to university. I went to University of Bristol, and I studied film, theatre and television. And for a long time, sort of through my teens, I was sort of very passionate about theatre. I couldn't really decide if I was going to sort of follow which route I was going to follow, the theatrical or the filmic route. So I think for me, I really fell in love with film sort of around 15, 16. And my school, I had a film club, and we had some amazing teachers who sort of just put some really, really, brilliant and challenging films in front of me at that sort of, that seminal age of sort of 15, 16, 17, when you start to really, mold your creative sensibilities. And yeah, I think for me, by the time I got to university, and I started to specialise in film. But in terms of practical filmmaking, no, my experience started when I started making tea and coffee on big film sets and worked my way up from there, really.
It is such a education when you are with a very high bar of filmmaking. Of course, it's going to wash through you. Of course, you're going to take on board all these little idiosyncrasies that people are doing, directors are doing. What is probably some of the bigger points, the bigger takeaway from working on set on these big productions that you found were really key and instrumental in you gaining the confidence to go on and shoot your first feature?
Well, that's a good question. I think for me there were sort of 2 disparate elements to it. The first was I was very fortunate to be working as an assistant director, because I'm not sure how much detail you want me to go into, but the assistant directors are a department within the film industry who ostensibly project manage a film. Their job is to assist the director in fulfilling his creative vision. So we look after, sort of all the human elements of a film. We look after, the cast, the crowd, stunts, and we also run the film day to day. Assistant directors are responsible for creating a schedule that the film revolves around and that gets shot. So for me, being able to work sort of cheek by jowl with some unbelievable directors and watching, watching the way they interact with cast, watching the way they interact with crew, the way they run their set, the way they communicate their ideas, the way they bring forward, the ideas that they work on in prep to execute on set. That was hugely important to me. But then I think the other element for me that I loved was being involved with the crew as a whole, being sort of involved in the practical day to day of I was very, very lucky to work on, I've worked at all levels of the film industry, from tiny independent things to huge studio movies, and to be able to, do these amazing chase sequences, or, choreographed fights or explosions, or, whatever. It's incredibly exciting. And yeah, I sort of really love being at the coalface. So yeah, for me, being able to work so closely with directors, and then also to see that all the bells and whistles of, a Hollywood movie, was very, very important to me.
So you're working as an assistant director. It's about managing people. And if you can do that on a big production, it does lend itself a long way down the rabbit hole of being able to do that on your first feature, in terms of managing people, managing all sorts of different things that are going to be coming through you as the director. So that in itself is probably just a huge takeaway.
Yeah, you couldn't have put it better, really. It's learning at the top end, at the sharp end of filmmaking, from the best and the brightest, and trying to apply that, in everything that I do, learning those lessons, on a practical level as an assistant director, and then applying them as a director. And yeah, for me, like, that's what I excelled at, I think, as an assistant director. I think I'm a pretty good communicator, and I found, because I was passionate about making films, and also, I really wanted to help make them as good as they could be. That zest for it, I think, really trickles into my directing. Well, I hope it does.
And when I say that you're working on these big productions as an assistant director, it's only a few years ago that Beauty and the Beast was out there. You were on the set before suddenly you're helming your first film, Terminal, in 2018. With some pretty big names here, including Margot Robbie, Simon Pegg, and Mike Myers, who I didn't recognize, although that's his specialty, to make you look twice. You were the writer and the director of Terminal. Tell us how you were able to, as a first-time filmmaker, able to not only sell the script and the concept, but also be attached to direct this film.
To be honest with you, Craig, it came about the way a lot of these things do, like pure dumb luck, really. Tom Ackley and Josie McNamara, who are astonishing producers now, and very close friends of mine, we were all runners and assistant directors together. We all came up together. And I'd been working with them. I knew they wanted to produce. They knew I wanted to direct, and we wanted to work together. And Tom and Josie went off to work on a film called Sweet Française, which starred one Margot Robbie. And they became very firm friends, and through them I met Margs. We hit it off and became good friends. And A Terminal at that point had been exhaustively written and rewritten. It had been in development through a variety of companies. Tom and Josie had it and really liked it and wanted to take it forward. They'd set up a burgeoning production company. At the time, they were living in a flat share in Clapham with Margs and about 6 or 7 other people. And Margs read the script and she loved it. And we met 2 weeks after that, and it sort of went from there. And look, like independent film is built around passion. It's built around good scripts and great actors wanting to tell stories, and when they lend their cachet to a project, when Margs became involved, to both star in it and to produce it, that galvanized the project. And that was in sort of late 2015. And we took it to the EFM in Berlin, Margs and I, with the sales agents and producers, and we shot summer of 2016. Yeah, so it all sort of came together from a mixture of a lot of hard work and pure dumb luck, really, to be honest.
So you've got Margot Robbie, you've got Simon Pegg. You then have to raise the money aspect. Just talk, especially for our indie filmmakers who are always curious as to how the money comes in. Just talk to that. I know that you've got producers that are working their magic. Obviously helps with Margot Robbie. Although, how much had she done at this stage in terms of her career when she came on board with your project?
So Margs had broken out with Wolf. She had shot Suicide Squad, but it hadn't come out. And she'd also shot Tarzan, but I don't think that had come out either. So, she was very, very much on the rise. It's a tricky one. Like, independent financing it's a minefield, isn't it? As I'm sure you and all your listeners know, it's very hard. And look, we were very blessed as a project with having Marg's attachment. That gave us the sort of kudos, to really take it out to market. And of course, film markets are exactly that. They're film markets. The international sales model is based on pre-selling the film to various territories in order to raise the finance to make the film. And that finance is predicated on the level of your cast. So who was, I think it was Mike who came on next. I'm a massive, Mike Myers fan. I mean, he was a huge sort of fixture of my adolescence, as I'm sure he was for a lot of people in terms of Wayne's World and Austin Powers. And, we took a pot shot. Mike, he writes a lot and he does a lot of his own stuff, but he's very, very selective. I think we sent him the scripts, and about a week later, I got a phone call from one of the producers saying Mike wants to speak to you, which, I mean, blew my socks off, to say the least. So, yeah, that's kind of how it all came about, really.
Director of photography, Christopher Ross, shot it. We're talking about Terminal. He lit it really well. The neon lighting with blue tints coming through. It's beautifully crafted with light design. Absolutely. How did you plan all of that with Christopher Ross, your cine?
It really started with a shared love of Blade Runner. If there was a genesis for the way we wanted to construct the cinematography of Terminal, it was a love of the boldness and the beauty and the duality of the lighting in Blade Runner. And for us, we knew we wanted to embrace neon, and we wanted to embrace kind of those bright and bold colors. And it was sort of very important within the story and also in creating the world of Terminal that those neons were very, very vivid and bold. And we often talked about trying to create the idea of a splash panel in a graphic novel, so one of those incredibly arresting vistas that sort of stick in the mind of the viewer or the reader, and it sort of helps shape the way they see the movie. But we also wanted to kind of give it a British flavour, a particularly sort of dystopianly British flavour. So we used a lot of tungsten, we used a lot of sort of drab yellows, we used a lot of cooler greens as well. So we tried to, give pretty much all frames that sort of sense of there being almost a juxtaposition in terms of the color palette. You've got these bright, bold, almost cartoonish neons, and then these kind of subsumed, quite eerie, tungsteny yellows and greens to sort of contrast that. It's got its roots in noir. It's got its roots in noir. Terminal. So, we wanted to really embrace light and dark, embrace the use of shadow, try and bring a certain sort of style and sort of a sense of danger and sexiness into the world, really, to sort of create that feel, that vibe that Terminal had. And Chris is incredible, and he's such a wonderful guy to work with and to collaborate with, and he really, he really embraced those sort of tropes of Terminal and gave it a very unique signature.
It's definitely got that. It's got its own look for sure. Even a spot, just a single spotlight, and the way that he is using a single spot. And I'm thinking in particular of the cafe behind, I think it was Margot, that spot coming in behind her. Very effective.
Which was bizarrely came about, as often these things do, because of an accident. So that was a fan. We sort of had this idea that we would love a fan to be circulating all the time, so that we had that sort of, I'm going to give such a terribly reductive example, but that sort of Apocalypse Now feel of the fan sort of created, the silhouette of the fan in front of the light, which gives that really interesting sort of, light on the actor's face. But it didn't work on day one. Unfortunately, there was a problem with it. The mechanical housing, they just couldn't get it to work, basically. So we sort of ended up with this spotlight. We thought that's really stunning. You've got this very cold, kind of bright light that's creating this pool that's sort of surrounded by these, pinks and blues, and it became a bit of a signature. And there's a scene in that cafe that takes place, the scene that we sort of, labeled The Betrayal, where a sort of devil's deal gets struck. Well, that whole scene was almost lit by that practical, which was fascinating to watch. What Chris did was absolutely brilliant. And I have to say, one of the things he did that I'll be forever grateful for was we didn't have a huge amount of money on that film, but I kept picking huge locations because we were in Budapest, which is an amazing place to shoot and has this sort of these different styles of architecture that rub really strangely against one another. This sort of beautiful old buildings of, the sort of Austro-Hungarian Empire that meet this sort of really cold, soft block, very brutalist architecture. And everywhere I went, I'd be like, oh, let's shoot there. Got, I couldn't have picked bigger locations, to be honest. And Chris came up with this lighting design where he would highlight and accent the building in such a way that it looked beautiful and rich and huge, but he was also able to create these pools of darkness that we could hide the stuff that we couldn't afford to dress or to decorate, which was actually created this kind of amazing sort of, I can't really describe it, kind of an in-between world, but it kind of played into this sort of dark fairy tale motif that I really wanted to create, and it was brilliant. It was him working with what he had, and yeah, I owe him a lot. He did a brilliant job.
And what was the film shot on, and how many days did it take to shoot?
We shot on the Arri. I'm sure we shot on the Arri. Now I'm doubting myself, wondering if we shot on the Red. I'll double check for you, but I think it was the Arri. And we shot on anamorphic primes, which they have that kind of luster and that sort of odd curvature to it that I absolutely love. We shot that in 27 days. It was very, very tight, that one.
It's quite demanding for what you've achieved in that film. The sound designer had a clear vision. Talk about the post of this film, because a lot of visual effects going on in post.
Yeah, so the sound designer, Nicola Medic, was amazing, absolutely amazing. He wanted to bring an otherworldliness to it, and anywhere he could create layers, he could create textures, this idea of this kind of hulking, rusting city that's surrounding us. He really went to town. He did a brilliant job. We knew we didn't want the visual effects to be photoreal in inverted commas. Like we wanted it to have a sense of we had references as varied as Blade Runner and Dick Tracy and Who Framed Roger Rabbit and Children of Men. We sort of knew we wanted to create a weird and sort of unique idiosyncratic version of a dystopian city that was reminiscent but not recognizable as London. Basically, that was our starting point. And so what we did a lot of, to save money, frankly, was we would create these incredible sort of composites. So we would shoot night exteriors in Budapest, or we did some in London, and then you'll have to forgive me because I don't know the right VFX terminology, but what we would effectively create was a collage where we would blend buildings and blend skylines, and then we would accent that with visual effects, full VFX builds where we needed to. And I think that we really wanted to create that uniqueness.
And Simon Pegg seems to be getting better with every film that he does. And there were some great exchanges between Pegg and Robbie in the cafe with plenty of coverage with different angles. Obviously, you worked through that sort of coverage to keep it interesting. So talk a little bit about that. And also would like to pick up on the pacing of the cut in post, because this has a real snappy pacing of cutting with the way that the film is edited.
I vividly remember the first day that we shot the cafe, Margs and Simon sat opposite each other and we did a crew rehearsal, and they did 7.5 pages perfectly. I mean, word perfect. Everyone was watching it like they were watching a play. I mean, it was incredible. Like, there was a fucking round of applause after the crew rehearsal because they just watched 7 minutes of two world-class actors turn my dialogue into something good. And I mean, they had the most amazing chemistry, Simon and Margs, and we really lent into that. They sort of start as awkward strangers, and Margs' character befriends Simon's character at a sort of very difficult time for him, and they end up falling into this sort of uneasy conversation that sort of lasts 3 or 4 hours. And in terms of the way that we covered it, we wanted to make sure it had a sense of sort of classical composition to it. Like, there were lots of shot reverses, both clean and dirty, to make sure that we had really nice coverage. But I remember talking to Chris and to Margs and Simon about In the Mood for Love, the Wong Kar-wai film, and that's sort of the way that he plays with the angles he uses, the way that he plays with the height of the camera, the way that you can sort of create interest and allure by short siding. We use a variety of techniques, short siding, moving the actor, sort of within the frame to create unconventional angles. We sort of use Dutch angles. I wanted to make sure that it stayed interesting. And I do, of course, amazing actors will make it interesting, but it was about, for me, being able to sort of create that sense of being lost in the story, of something that was odd and unconventional. Once we got into the edit, I was blessed to work with two amazing editors in Johannes Bock and Alex Marquez, and what was so brilliant about their delivery, and I have to say with Dexter and Max, who sort of form the B side of the Simon and Margot story, they had this brilliant sort of rat-a-tat rhythm to the way that they delivered their dialogue, and there was a natural pace that was quick, as naturalistic conversation between two intelligent people tends to be. There wasn't a lot of pauses for dramatic effect apart from where they were needed. So I think we wanted to really pay homage to that in the way that we cut it. And we wanted it to move along at that clip that they themselves had sort of set on set. So, we didn't really need to suck too much air out of it in the cut. It sort of played at the naturalistic pace that the actors delivered it at.
Yeah, it's interesting with the coverage, different angles, the Dutch angles that you talk about. Boy, it makes a big difference to something like a cafe scene where you've got two actors, you've got so many pages to get through, and it just sort of breaks it up with cutting at different points and different frames.
Yeah, it really does. And look, I think everything is subservient to story. Everything is in service of the story, right? But what you can also do within that is the conversation takes these odd twists and turns as they became more companionable with one another. Like they moved into these sort of weird and sort of odd pieces of conversation. Their conversation ranges into sort of, various ways of committing suicide, it becomes a sort of odd, bizarre fly-by-night conversation. And it was definitely the idea and the intention for myself and for Chris when he was shooting it and the editors was to start in a more classical mode. And then as the conversations sort of took these odd turns and they sort of ended up going into these weird and wacky places, then we sort of allowed ourselves to be more flamboyant and expressive with the camera language and the way that we sort of told the story.
And your latest film is Every Breath You Take, starring Casey Affleck, Michelle Monaghan, and Sam Claflin. Let's bring in your cinematographer into the conversation who shot this film, Michael Merriman. Michael, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So you guys have collaborated on a couple of films together. The other film was Inheritance. Michael, how did your paths cross?
I was actually very fortunate to start our love affair that began on Inheritance. I think it occurred due to that film being pushed due to an actor availability. Therefore, it disabled the crew that was lined up for it. And it took a pause, and a producer, an acquaintance of mine, actually connected us. And our magic spawned from there.
The relationship between a cinematographer and director, we know, is a critical component to filmmaking. And there is this elevation that can happen to a film when a director and a DP are so in sync with each other. Do you guys have that sort of working relationship now after two films?
I believe so. I think that we don't even really have to talk to each other anymore.
I'm honoured and very fortunate to have Merriman as my cinematographer. He just brings a wonderful positivity with him, and we really try and sort of create a lovely place to work.
And there's no doubt that when that relationship goes into a second and third project together, the aesthetic look of a film and the speed of setups and the tone on set all helps with a confidence for a working relationship. How do you typically tend to work? Give us a sense on, say, blocking to shooting a scene together.
We actually start in previs. Once we get our locations finalized, then we have a lot of fun of how do we see it happening, where we see it happening, and how it's going to kind of unravel. So at least we make a decision on what we would like to do. So at least once we get to the location and the actors feel something differently or whatnot, then at least we can change our minds. But we have a we kind of have a common philosophy together. Vaughn and I do that. We can't change our mind until we've made up our mind. So let's make a decision. So therefore, we can be open to anything else once the magic all starts to kind of get into the room together.
Yeah, having that plan, particularly in independent film when, time is short and days go quick, having that plan and always having the fallback of knowing inside out what we want to achieve with the scene and being able to work closely with the actors in rehearsal and then in blocking and then shooting to make sure that we can do the best we can with what we have.
And talking about just how tricky set can be, you've got some interesting credits, Michael, including working as a camera operator for the Revenant. Now, everyone talks about how brutal that film shoot was. What was your takeaway on your experience on that film?
It was magical. There was a lot of stress. There's working in an open environment with those type of conditions prevents a lot of things from working correctly. So it's constantly problem solving. And I was fortunate enough to be a lot in a helicopter, so I got to be above a lot of those problems a lot of the times. But it was definitely, that crew was amazing. And a lot of people came and went just because it would chew up crew and spit it out. So it was quite an amazing experience though. All you have to do is just watch Chivo work and your inspiration is there.
And the long rehearsal periods, got to ask about that. What stands out the most for you with all of the time that it took to lock in the camera moves and the performance before camera actually turned over on that shoot? Because there was a lot of rehearsing, wasn't there, every day?
They did a good job of prepping what they wanted before they got there. So there definitely was a lot of rehearsing. It definitely took a long time to achieve, they're all perfectionists at their craft. Sometimes greatness takes a while to get achieved. It's like it has a slow build and evolution, and it's subjective to each artist independently. So everyone has their own paintbrush, so to speak. And until it all comes together and only the director sees it, how it's going to come together. So it's kind of like Fincher in a way where they're perfectionists. They'll shoot 35 takes if they need to. Sometimes what you start, the performances that begin in the scene, by the time you're on the 5th take or 10th take or 15th take, it's a completely different actor, a completely different character than what started that scene. So it did take a long time to design, build, and execute. That was just the ones that I didn't witness myself. I was fortunate enough to be in a helicopter a lot, to be flying above a lot of that.
So you were shooting some wides from the helicopter, or what were you doing in the helicopter?
In the helicopter, we were fortunate enough, we had a long line, which is about a 40 to 60 foot static line that you float a stabilized head underneath it. And that stabilized camera head, you fly very straight lines, so you have a very slow movement. It's very similar to the Cam system. We also put an array on that helicopter, which was, I think, 8 red cameras, all lined up to shoot 180 degrees and sweep through canyons with it.
So the first film that you did together was Inheritance. Vaughn, I only watched this last night. The design of the bunker looked like a lot of thought went into it, and I presume that was a design build on a soundstage, or was that something pre-existing?
No, it was a build on a stage.
So tell us a little bit about what went into the design and the look of that bunker and the way that you worked with Michael to get the lighting all sort of set up the way that you wanted it to look.
We had an idea from the outset that we wanted it to feel reminiscent of a sort of nuclear fallout shelter. And I remember talking to Diane Millett, who was the production designer, when we were, sort of in preliminary designs. There were these stories that I'd heard about these sort of reclusive millionaires in upstate New York who, at the height of the Cold War, had basically built themselves, underground fallout shelters for them and their family that were, like a sort of suite of underground rooms. And that sort of formed the basis. That was the spine of the idea. Now, we decided not to reference it in the script, but for us, that sort of played quite a key role. It was this idea that it was this sort of self-contained bunker that exists on the edge of this sort of dynastical American family's estate. That was sort of the starting point. And then what Merriman and I wanted to do, particularly within the cell, the place where so much of it took place, was to be able to create a space that was, stylistically interesting, but also kind of claustrophobic and sort of had that sense of that sense of the walls closing in, which of course presents its own problems because we spent a lot of time in that bunker. We wanted to make sure it stayed visually engaging for the audience.
And the second film, Every Breath You Take, starring Casey Affleck, Michelle Monaghan and Sam Claflin. I can see your style coming to the fore here, Michael, in terms of the way that you shot it. You have I don't like to say distinctive style, but there's definitely a cross thread that you can see with Inheritance coming through with Every Breath.
Oh, wow. Thanks. I'm still trying to figure out what that style is myself. I just try to take a location and inspire. I think luckily with Every Breath You Take, we were in this beautiful Northwestern Pacific Northwest that has more of a Nordic noir color palette to it. So I kind of use that for my inspiration in terms of style, lighting, a little softer. It's constantly overcast there. You have a lot of movements with clouds. So I tried to embrace that and use that as inspiration and how I lit the film and what I embraced in the exterior locations as well.
Really like the psychology room and the way that all looked and felt. And then when we went to the flashbacks, much more brighter. So quite a contrast, a distinction between, flashback and, for example, in the psychology room, the way that you staged that.
Yeah, I think we wanted to go for something that would really stick out a little more distinctly. We tried to give it a little more of a bleach bypass look. So, and it's also how you have memories. There's also an emotion that's attached to every memory that you have. And, you wanted to really have the viewer feel that emotion, not necessarily what emotion, not telling them what to feel, but evoke something of their own is kind of how the design we were going for.
And there was some nice depth of some of those shots where you could see a bit of depth in the house and out through the window. How important is that for you, looking for depth when you're shooting a scene?
I love it. I think depth is where the magic happens. I think foreground is anything in a foreground is special because it really allows the viewer to reach out and it pushes you to try and look deeper. Everything being shot close and wide is beautiful for an emotional scene, but I love to kind of give the viewer a landscape to play with and have their own imagination run wild.
All right, Michael. Well, great to catch up and keep creating that mood lighting of yours. And thanks so much for coming on to Shoot It Now.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a beautiful day.
Well, Vaughn, it was great adding you to the mix of film directors that was spoken to. Thank you so much for taking your time for speaking to us on Shoot It Now.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to Shoot It Now with Craig Newland, your weekly podcast about all things behind the camera and in front of it. Until next time, have a great week.